It is my honor to introduce our speaker today, historian and author Katherine Rinehart. Much of Petaluma's past is reflected in its historic architecture, and Katherine is certainly our expert. Katherine's the author of Petaluma, A History in Architecture, and I hope you all own that book. She holds an MA in history from Sonoma State University, and she's the former manager of the Sonoma County History and Geneaology Library and Sonoma County Archives. Katherine's the current chair of the Sonoma County Heritage Network. She's worked in numerous positions within the field of special collections and archives, historic preservation, heritage tourism, and interpretation. She specializes in house history, documentation, general research, and teaching, writing, and creating exhibits. One accolade that we all know Katherine is particularly proud of is her status as an official Petaluma Good Egg. And with that, I'd like to introduce Katherine Reinhart.
Great. Thank you, Colleen, and I hope you'll all bear with me as I sort of figure out the tech piece here. Okay, are we good, Bob? Okay, all right. So thank you, Colleen, and the Women's Club and the Village Network for hosting my first ever virtual presentation. And good evening to everyone out there. I'm excited to be here sharing a bit of Petaluma's history that until about a year and a half ago, I knew little about. I knew a thing or two about Petaluma's architectural history, but I had never viewed it within the context of women's history. But first things first, how did I get involved in the Petaluma Museum's current exhibit on women's suffrage? Well, it was after reading a post that I wrote about the 19th Amendment centennial for the Sonoma County History and Geneaology Library back in January of 2019, that I was contacted by Paula Freund, a Petaluma Museum volunteer and someone who has, as well as an art historian. Paula has put on a number of exhibits for the Petaluma Museum that all have been first rate. So Paula wanted to know if I'd be willing to join her in co-curating an exhibit for the Petaluma Museum on the role of the local community in the suffrage movement. I agreed, and now that exhibit is up and running. And although you cannot visit the museum, you can see the exhibit virtually. Paula's done a really nice gallery tour, and a little bit more on that later on here. So, as someone who enjoys learning about history by way of the built environment, I was interested in finding out not only the who, but the where. And I got inspiration from the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Where Women Made History initiative, as well as the National Votes for Women Trail projects. These are both crowdsourcing sites where people are uploading information about sites where women made history. The National Votes for Women Trail specifically to suffrage. Now, somewhat of maybe a disclaimer or alert, women's suffrage is a complex topic, and it's not something that I can fully explore and share with you within the parameters of tonight's presentation. For a deeper dive, I strongly recommend checking out some of the resources that I'll mention tonight, as well as watching Paula's virtual tour, which is on YouTube and available through the museum's website, as well as John Sheehy's blog, Petaluma Historian. John Sheehy has wrote a number of posts about suffragists, Petaluma suffragists, and much of the content from those blogs is also reflected in the exhibit itself. So he's a really great resource, and the three of us have had a really good time working together and learning from each other as well. My focus is on sites, the physical reminders of past that until now have not been documented for their association with the suffrage movement. First, I had to determine if there was a women's suffrage movement in Petaluma. So my research began, was there anyone advocating for women's right to vote or not in Petaluma prior to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the centennial of which we're celebrating this year? Traditional Sonoma County histories include very little on the topic. So I turned to an authority on the subject, Robert P.J. Cooney Jr., in his book, Winning the Vote, The Triumph of the American Women Suffrage Movement. This is an outstanding resource, and it's available through the National Women's History Alliance, which I can't say enough about. A fantastic resource for not just suffrage history, but any aspect of women's history that you may be interested in or have yet to discover. Also, the National Women's History Alliance started out as the National Women's History Project and was founded in Sonoma County 40 years ago. So that's pretty cool. What I discovered is that since California women had secured the vote in 1911, there wasn't much leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment here in Petaluma, meaning between 1911 and 1920, there wasn't a lot going on, so we took it back. The focus of tonight's presentation will be on events relating to the establishment of Sonoma County's Women's Suffrage Association in 1869, the 1896 campaign that was defeated, and the passage of the Constitutional Amendment number 8, which granted women the right to vote in California for the first time in 1911. Now, Robert Cooney's book and others helped provide the context I needed while looking at Petaluma's suffrage activity, but to get a local perspective, I needed to explore primary resources specific to Sonoma County. And so I started with newspapers, and we're really fortunate here in Sonoma County because we have access to several Sonoma County newspapers that have been digitized and are accessible through the newspapers.com and the California Digital Newspaper Project, both of which are available free and with your library card. So, using different search terms, suffrage, equality, votes for women, so forth, resulted in a jackpot of names of individuals and organizations, which then I could take and be strategic in my research. I could focus on census, city directories, historical maps, photo archives, family trees that were created on ancestry.com and familysearch.org. Not so strategic was a Google search that led me to a petition for women's suffrage that was submitted to the California legislature in 1870 that was signed by 474 Petalumans. Let's see, I'm gonna try and do something here. Nope, it didn't work. Okay, sorry, just trying to get used to the technology here. Okay, 1870 petition, 424 Petalumans signed it, asking the California State Legislature for votes for women. This petition followed the establishment of the Sonoma County Suffrage Association and the California Women's, so the Sonoma County Suffrage Association and the California Women's Suffrage Association, of which Petaluma's own Abigail Goodwin Haskell was an officer of both. Abigail Goodwin played a role in establishing the Sonoma County Women's Suffrage Association. I can't tell you how many times I've said that in the last few days. She established it at her home on 4th Street between B and C in 1869. And here's a notice in a newspaper that's describing, we're gonna get together, we're gonna talk about suffrage, come to my house at 2 o'clock. A.A. Haskell. Okay, so that's happening December 1869. A month later in San Francisco, we have the Women's State Convention. And at the, I love this name, the Dashaway Hall, we see the creation of the California Women's Suffrage Association. And Abigail ends up being the president of that organization. So she's actually the secretary of the Sonoma County chapter, and she's the president of the state chapter. So Abigail and her home as a site for where the first Sonoma County Suffrage Association was established is kind of a big deal. Well, very elusive. And it was using a combination of city directories, newspapers, articles, and historic maps that I think with a capital T, I know where that house was. And so here we are. Don't be distracted by Women's Relief Corps. That's a topic for another lecture. What we're looking at here is, this is B Street right here, and this is 4th Street. So it's the west side of 4th between B and C. That would be where the Haskell home was. Today, it's Napa Auto Parts. Kind of sad. But house aside, Abigail is well represented in the museum's exhibit, thanks to her great-great-granddaughter, Ann Nissen, who has loaned some amazing artifacts about her ancestor. And again, Abigail served as the secretary of the Sonoma County Women's Association, and in that role, she was responsible for bringing a lot of lecturers to town to speak to the topic. Lecturers such as Reverend Ames and Laura DeForest Gordon. And they spoke at what was called Hinshaw Hall. More on that in a second. First, a little bit about Ames. He was a Unitarian clergyman, editor, and lecturer who, along with his wife, Fanny Baker Ames, assisted in the founding of the California Women's Suffrage Association. And Laura DeForest Gordon, a feminist, a spiritual, a lecturer, a lawyer, newspaper editor, and founding member of the California Women's Suffrage Association. So they all knew Abigail, and so they were invited to come up in January of 1870. And where they spoke, and this is kind of a little weird juxtaposition, I believe that the Hinshaw Hall was located at the corner of Petaluma Boulevard North and East Washington. Again, using historic maps. I also got an assist from a fellow history detective, Terry Park, who's a volunteer at the Petaluma Museum. We're kind of going back and forth. Where do you think this building was? Here it is in the background. I'm not quite sure what the camels are all about. I think the circus must have come to town. Maybe the same day as the ponies, I'm not sure. But again, here's that same building. Here it is again. And it was torn down in, and the hall would have been upstairs, and it was torn down in the 1960s and would have been where this tree is today. And actually, East Washington Street has been widened, so it was bigger than the tree. So Hinshaw Hall is gone. Have no fear, we do have a standing building that I can talk about. Might not look like it in this picture, but okay. By the 1880s, the Petaluma Theater was the place to be if you were on the suffrage lecture circuit. And this was a building that is on, believe it or not, Kentucky Street between Western and Washington Street. And it was built in 1870 by the Washington Hall Association. And it's been known as the Petaluma Theater, the Washington Hall, the McClay Building, the Opera House, so forth. When it was designed by San Francisco architects Stephen H. Williams and Son of San Francisco. And it was Frances Willard who spoke here in 1883. Many of you may know this, but for those who don't, Frances was the founder of the National Women's Christian Temperance Union, and it's a founder, and she was its second president. And under her leadership, the WCTU grew to be the largest organization of women in the 19th century. It was also, here's the key, it was under Willard's leadership that the WCTU formally endorsed women's suffrage. Willard and other leaders of the WCTU recognized that women's ability to vote was essential to achieving the goals of the organization. That went beyond temperance, although that was their main mission. Sometimes it's really hard to find pictures of people, but I love this one. Another speaker was Sarah Severance. She spoke here in 1893 and born in New York, graduated from the Oneida Conference Seminary in 1857. 1862, she moves to San Jose, sets up a private school. Then she joins the WCTU and is elected state superintendent of California. The WCTU provided, I mean, obviously these women were interested in the mission, but it provided these opportunities to be leaders, to hold office and make change. And so that's why we see a lot of crossover between the WCTU and suffrage. Anyway, in the 1890s, she was funded by the WCTU to tour the state of California promoting school suffrage. And I found this great quote yesterday that talks about her being quite the humorist, a lionist of orators, and I wish I could have been around to hear her speak. Okay, probably more familiar to folks are Dr. Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt. Anna Howard Shaw spoke at the Petaluma Theater twice, once in 1895 and the other in 1896. And this is leading up to the 1896 election. So people, not just women, people are coming from around the country to California to help us get the vote. And so we have these heavy hitters showing up. Anna Howard Shaw was a physician, one of the first ordained female Methodist ministers. She was president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association at the time of her visit to Petaluma. She was also the chair of the WCTU franchise department, and it was under the auspices of the local WCTU chapter that she spoke here in 1895. Excuse me. Carrie Chapman Catt apparently delivered a brilliant address on suffrage at the theater on October 29th, 1896. So that's just like days from the election. She lectured under the auspices of the Petaluma Political Equality Club. And 4 years later, she would serve as the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she was the founder of the League of Women Voters. Back to the building. I had such a hard time toggling back and forth because they're equally interesting. So here's our building again. I've only found 2 pictures of the Petaluma Theater, both at the Sonoma County Library. So here we are. This is Kentucky Street. And again, this building was constructed in 1870. In 1901, it got a major remodel. I'm not sure when this picture was taken, but it roughly looks like what the building looks like today at 145 Kentucky Street. Now, this building is individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places, one of few in Petaluma, and it's also a contributor to the Downtown Historic District. Yet, all the documentation that's been done, no mention of Carrie Chapman Cat or Anna Howard Shaw, or the significance from that viewpoint. There is reference to Mark Twain apparently speaking here, but I'm not sure if that actually occurred. Okay, so the Petaluma Theater also served as the where Ellen Putnam, a local suffragist, gave her inaugural speech. So Ellen Putnam, along with her husband, and let's change the slide here for a minute, with her husband Isaac and several members of her extended family, signed that 1870 petition I mentioned earlier. And she gave her first address on the topic of suffrage under the auspices of the California State Equality Campaign Committee on October 2nd, 1896. We don't have a photo of Ellen. I do know where she's buried. She's at Cypress Hill. And one fun thing that I've been trying to do is when I identify a suffragist that has what's called a Find a Grave site, is you can actually you can post a flower to that site and provide a little text. So somebody stumbling upon this site will know a little bit more about Ellen Putnam thanks to this post. Now, Ellen was a founding member and treasurer of the Sonoma County Women's Suffrage Association, along with Abigail Haskell. She helped found two other suffrage groups, one in 1896 and another in 1902. And she also, at the request of the California Women's Suffrage Central Committee, she organized suffrage clubs in Napa County. So she was on the road. She hosted a number of meetings for suffrage and also temperance at her home, which was initially on D Street. This was not the house, but this is where it was located. She moved to Petaluma in the 1860s with her husband. And in 1899, the house was at that location, was pushed back on the lot. And so now it faces E Street and is still there. Okay, all right. Ellen was active member and clerk of the Petaluma First Congregational Church, shown here at the corner of 5th and B. There is not a congregational church anymore, but there is a church at this corner presently, but it faces B Street. This church was built in 1857, and it was the site of many suffrage meetings. Here's an example of just one club meeting that was held in 1896. I love this because it shows some action. They're not only just meeting, but they're talking about how they've been out canvassing, getting signatures, stumping for the vote, so to speak. The church, the Congregational Church, was also significant because it was where the Petaluma chapter and the California chapter of the WCTU, again, Women's Christian Temperance Union, it says so right there, was founded. And it was this great resource that I found online that talked all about that. And if you could, and again, I think it's significant here, the Petaluma chapter was created for the WCTU, and then a few months, the state chapter. Lots going on. Petaluma's the place to be. We're the ones kind of starting things. Pretty impressive. And if you could read over here, which I don't know if you can or not, and you see executive committee of that initial state chapter, you'll see the names of many Petalumans, many of who went on to be involved in leadership roles in the suffrage movement, including Susan Whitney. Susan Whitney, let's see here, I've gotten ahead of myself. Susan Whitney moved into this house at the corner of E and 6th Street in the 1860s with her husband Albion Paris Whitney, who was a grain merchant and later a state senator for California, along with their 6 children. The house was probably built in the 1860s. During the 1890s, Susan Whitney's parlors were often filled with members of the WCTU, the Political Equality League, and a host of other organizations that she was involved with. And it was at this house that the plans for Carrie Chapman Catt's visit to Petaluma in the fall of 1896 were discussed. I don't know, I doubt Carrie Chapman Catt slept here, but she was certainly discussed here. Here is, let's see, I need to move this so I can read. So here we see the Whitney House here in this postcard from the museum. And what I love is this article I found on the day of the election in 1896. Susan Whitney is out there with Katherine Denman, who's actually her neighbor, and they are putting up signs, tacking up signs near polling places. And I love this, so visual. Her white dress, her white horse, drew Mrs. Whitney's phaeton, bearing the slogan on its broadside, "Vote for the 6th Amendment." How I would love to have a picture of that scene. But we need to just imagine it from what we read in the newspaper. Okay, house next door. This is the home of Isabel Denman, and it was actually built in 1886 by Arthur Whitney, Susan's son, and also Isabel's son-in-law, but I'm getting in the weeds there. Anyway, it was at this house that the first meeting of the Petaluma Political Equality Club had. Now, I haven't found evidence of Mrs. Denman actually being a board member, but she certainly was active. She's mentioned at their meetings. So she moved into this house with her husband Ezekiel Denman in 1891. He was her second husband. The house still stands, and both houses are in the A Street Historic District. Yet again, nothing about their nomination, so to speak, mentions these associations. Okay, the second parlor meeting of the Political Equality Club was held at the home of Josephine Pilkington Hill. And this on 7th Street, did I say that already? Again, through newspaper articles, we get a sense a large, enthusiastic, and cultured band of women were assembled at Mrs. William Hill's parlors. Josephine Pilkington Hill and her husband, William, signed another signers of the 1870 petitions. She was active in the WCTU, and she was a charter member of Petaluma's Political Equality League, one time serving as vice president. She was also, as many in the audience know, was a member of the Petaluma Women's Club, which was organized in 1895. Find a grave. I was so excited. I could not find a picture of Josephine Hill at the museum, the library, the usual places. It wasn't until I went to Find a Grave where a relative of Josephine's had posted this picture, a woman by the name of Melissa Hill Spees, I was pronouncing that right, who has since loaned a number of images to the exhibit and to the museum for the exhibit, which we really thank her for. Back to the house. The house we see here was built in 1894 for William Hill and Josephine Hill by local builder Samuel Rodd, and it was designed by local architect T.R. Jacobs. Now, Josephine died, I think, in 1917 or 1918, and the house went to her heirs, And in 1920, the house underwent an amazing remodel. And I see remodel because I've actually seen the blueprints that show this house sort of in the background. So I don't know if this house kind of got incorporated into this house and they lobbed off the third story. I'm not sure what happened. But we know that Raynor Jones was involved. We've got this great sketch that he did, and then here it is today. And it was designed in 1920 specifically to be a duplex. Okay, so the 1896 election ended in defeat for those seeking women's suffrage. Things kind of go quiet until about 1902, when I find reference to this woman, Florence Jackson Stoddard, making a presentation at the Presbyterian Church. Florence Jackson Stoddard was a prominent journalist and organizer for the California Women's Suffrage Association. And she was here on September 29th, 1902. In 1903, we find Gail Laughlin, a lawyer, suffragist, and expert for the United States Industrial Commission, speaking at the Guild Hall of St. John's. And so St. John's, still there today, located on the corner of C and 5th Street. Behind it is the Guild Hall. And I just recently learned that the Guild Hall, this building, was here originally where this house is, and served as the church until this building, the current St. John's, was constructed in 1890. And it was designed by a very prominent San Francisco or Bay Area architect named Ernest Coxhead. This building is in the A Street Historic District. So it was at that meeting, again, we keep seeing these reorganizations of these suffrage clubs and leagues and associations, but it's all the same people kind of moving around. And it's all tied to, you know, winning an election and not winning and then gearing up for the next. So it's great. I love newspaper articles like this. Boom, we see Ellen Button, she's the president, Josie Hill, vice president, Susan Whitney's the treasurer, and some other folks, which I didn't include in tonight's talk. Back to the building. Okay, so here's another picture of the church. Better picture maybe of the Guild Hall. The Guild Hall, also, I guess I should mention, that is where the Women's Club met prior to the construction of their clubhouse on B Street. So it has importance for that. Unfortunately, it burned down in 1947. And here's what replaced it. Okay, now ramping up. October 1911 is on the horizon. And the Hill Opera House is now the place to come and talk about suffrage. Hill Opera House was built for Josephine Hill and her son A.B. in 1904. Some articles say it was built as a tribute to William Hill. It was designed by San Francisco architects Havens, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this right, Toepke, T-O-E-P-K-E. Building, some of you probably know what building this is. It's quite disguised now, but it's on Keller and Washington Streets. And that building, the Hill Opera House, eventually becomes the California Theater, and now today is the Phoenix Theater. So not just a lecture, but we're having a suffrage rally going on here. And so we see people like Anna Morrison Reed, introducing speakers like Helen M. Wixon, State Superintendent of Public Instruction in Colorado. And again, we're coming up to the 1911. It's really important for the nation, for those interested at the all around, that California succeed this time. So we have people coming from all over the place to come and talk. And so Anna Morrison Reed is fascinating. I could do a whole talk just on her. But guess what? John Sheehy's written about her for his blog, and she's well represented in the exhibit. But just a few things. She was a lecturer, a poet, a magazine and a newspaper editor from Ukiah and Petaluma. She kind of bounced back and forth. In her early 20s, she traveled throughout the counties of Northern California, lecturing on temperance and women's issues. She actively campaigned for suffrage beginning in 1904. The same year, she published the first issue of the Northern Crown that she would manage and edit for the next 16 years. She's tackling progressive issues of her time, women's rights, education for young children, organized labor, forest environment, in particular forest management, how timely, and temperance. In 1918, she ran for state assembly, but did not make it. Anyway, she was here, not anyway, that's just the tip of the iceberg. She was here acting as sort of the MC for some of these folks, which also included Reverend Akid, again, not sure I got the name right there, who was a minister of the First Congregational Church in San Francisco, and he was making the circuit on behalf of the College Equal Suffrage League. He's a heavy hitter. 1908, when he was living in New York and was the pastor of the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church, which is called the Rockefeller Church. He's speaking on the same platform, so to speak, with Carrie Chapman Cat at Carnegie Hall. I love this. Here's someone I'm really want to know more about, and that would be Helen Hoy Greeley. She's a suffragist, a lawyer, political activist, and she was from New York. And she was affiliated with the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women that Elizabeth Cady Stanton Harriet had formed. And in 1911, even though she's from New York, she is in California, specifically Sonoma County, San Francisco, and much of southeastern California to help convince voters in previously areas of anti-suffrage. Okay, I gotta speed it up here. Among her arguments for women's enfranchisement was a reminder that over 8,500 women were teachers in California, but they were unable to vote for the position of county superintendent of schools. Okay. October 10th, 1911 comes. The men get out and vote. Well, what we see is this breakdown. It barely passed. The Sixth Amendment, at that time it was the Proposition 4, barely passed. In Sonoma County, there was 2,461 in favor, 2,271 against. It is not a slam dunk. In Petaluma, kind of sorry to say this, but it was 471 in favor and 460 against. Very close. It was the rural communities that actually put it over the edge. And that's a whole nother topic that deserves more attention, is the role of the Granges and the ag community in supporting suffrage. But that is covered in the exhibit. And I hope that at some point you can actually go into the exhibit and see all that great information and experience it. So we won, not by a whole lot. I have yet to find any articles that talk about any sort of celebration occurring, but I do know from the index to register voters that women took getting that vote seriously. Can't read this very well, but I'll share a little bit with you. In 1912, the city of Petaluma consisted of 11 precincts, 4 more than they'd had in 1911 because they had all these additional voters. And then they had the 3 rural precincts. There were 3,436 Petalumans who registered to vote in 1912. 43% were women. And I had help with this math and all of this from John and Paula. I can't claim to have crunched the numbers by myself. About 70% of those women listed their occupation as housewives, housekeepers, retired, at home, married women, or daughters. The remaining women gave their occupation, and those are highlighted here in yellow. This is the precinct number 1, which was over in what we would call Old East Petaluma today, where we have dressmakers, teachers, laundresses, silk mill workers, telephone operators, a nurse, a baker, seamstress, librarian, author, etc. So these women showed their support for suffrage by registering. Now, moving ahead a little bit, Helen Putnam would have only been 3 years old in 1912, but so she didn't register. But thanks to those I've talked to and others, when she was 21, she was eligible to vote. And when she was 37, she was elected to the Petaluma Board of Education. And when she was 56, she was elected to serve as Petaluma's first female mayor. And when she was 69, she was elected to the Board of Supervisors, Sonoma County Board of Supervisors, only the second woman to do so. These accomplishments all occurred while Helen and her family resided at this house on B at the corner of Fair. And I've heard it said that Helen liked to say, "I live at the corner of B and Fair, and that's my motto." The house was built in 1905. It was purchased by Helen's mother-in-law, Mabel Putnam, in 1922. Helen married Rutherford Putnam in 1937, and a few years later, they moved to 900 B Street. And here she is with her family, and through all this, I've been so fortunate to have made the acquaintance of Helen's daughter, Kate, right here. I've spoken to her daughter-in-law, Barbara, here, and her grandson, Adam. Someday I may actually meet them face to face. Anyway, they've provided these images for me, for us, really. I particularly like this one. Here she is at the Nerve Center of 900 B Street with her trusty assistant, Fred. When I first looked at this picture, I thought it was a tray table, but it's actually an old school desk. It's kind of interesting. Now, although no plaque exists in front of Helen's former residence, many are aware, well, there is a plaque. There's a Heritage Homes plaque, but I don't think it says anything about Helen. Many are aware that her house at the corner of B and Fair is where a woman made history. In addition, we have the Helen Putnam Regional Park. We have Putnam Plaza in downtown Petaluma, and there's actually a Putnam Park in Cotati. And in 1982, the California League of Cities created an award in her honor. And guess what? She was the first woman elected to serve as president of that organization. Now, the other women I've spoken about tonight who are included in the exhibits have not individually or collectively been recognized. Their contributions to Petaluma history until now has largely been hidden. Earlier, but we know who they are, and we know these sites now, and we can do something about this, bringing them out of the shadows. I mentioned the National Trust, where women made history, the National Votes for Women Trail. These are crowdsourcing. You can nominate sites pretty easily. You want to take it a step further, there's a California Register of Historical Resources. This is basically the California version of the National Register. This is something that I think maybe the Women's Club is pursuing at this point in time, which is great. But there's more research to be done. But the good news is there's lots of information out there. When I first started this research, not very much. I would say in the last 18 months, because of the centennial, the access to digital material has quadrupled. It's amazing. And in some ways, I wonder if COVID has helped. People have time to pull those things out of their closets and start making them accessible to the public. I mentioned the National Women's History Alliance, can't say enough about them. Oops. Locally, we have the Sonoma County 2020 Women's Suffrage Project, Bernice Espinoza here, along with Leslie Graves, two amazing women doing great stuff. Leslie's created a website, a Facebook page, together with Bernice has hosted and organized so many programs and events. They're awesome and leaders of today. Don't forget the virtual tour. And if you're interested in just Petaluma architecture in general, of course, there's my book, which has been mentioned already. But a book that doesn't get a lot of recognition is the Celebrating Petaluma book that came out for the city's sesquicentennial in 2007. And I had the honor of being asked to write a chapter for this book. And so I teamed up with my friend and architectural historian, Marianne Hurley, and we have a chapter on landmarks. And this book's a little hard to get, especially now with so many places you would normally go to buy it being closed. If you are interested in getting a copy, please feel free to contact me through my website. And I've talked a lot and I've probably cut into our question and answer period, but we will have some. But I want to remind you that you can go to my website, send me a question, something I said tonight, something more you want to learn about Sonoma County history. Happy to respond. So